In the spring of 1912, a German novelist visited his wife at a Swiss sanatorium. She was being treated for tuberculosis. He planned to stay for 3 weeks. A doctor examined him during his visit. "I found a moist spot on your lung," the doctor said. "You should consider remaining here for treatment, perhaps 3 months." Thomas Mann refused. He returned to Munich. He began writing. 12 years later, he published a novel about a young man who visits his cousin at a Swiss sanatorium. The young man plans to stay for 3 weeks. He remains for 7 years. Here is the strangest part of this story. When doctors later re-examined his wife's original X-rays, they found no evidence of tuberculosis. She had never had the disease at all. The greatest tuberculosis novel ever written. A book that would win its author the Nobel Prize, that would define an entire era, that would be called one of the most important works in the history of literature, was born from a misdiagnosis. From an illness that wasn't real. From a cure that didn't work. From 3 weeks that became 12 years. And here is something stranger still. The novel would predict with uncanny precision the catastrophe that was about to engulf Europe. It would diagnose a civilization's sickness before the symptoms became visible to anyone else. It would see the war coming, the World Festival of Death, and describe it in terms that would haunt readers for the next century. This is the story of the Magic Mountain, of Thomas Mann and his Enchanted Mountain, of a young engineer named Hans Castorp who went to visit a sanatorium and never came home. Welcome to the Sanatorium. Tonight we're exploring one of literature's greatest novels, a book about time and death and disease, about love and philosophy and the collapse of European civilization. A book that was intended as a short comedic novella and became a 1,200-page epic. A book written in the shadow of one world war and published in the ruins of another. If you've journeyed with us before to Davos, to that alpine town that tuberculosis built, then you already know the world we're entering tonight. The same cure terraces, the same mountain air, the same patients wrapped in blankets, breathing deeply, watching the snow fall on the peaks above. But tonight, we're not just visiting the sanatoriums, we're entering the mind of the man who immortalized them. We're following Thomas Mann from the merchant houses of Lübeck to the balconies of Davos, from the outbreak of the First World War to the Nobel Prize ceremony in Stockholm. We'll walk the corridors of the Berghof Sanatorium where Hans Castorp spent 7 enchanted years. We'll listen to the great debates between reason and passion, between life and death. We'll stand with hands in the snow, lost in a blizzard, dreaming of paradise and horror. And we'll follow Thomas Mann himself through the darkest chapters of the 20th century, through exile and loss, through the rise of fascism and the destruction of everything he loved, through the long years of speaking across an ocean to a homeland that no longer wanted him. It is a long journey, but the night is long, and the fire is warm, and there is nowhere else we need to be. So settle in, find a comfortable position, let your breathing slow, let the mountain air fill your lungs, that thin, cold, impossibly clear air that was supposed to cure tuberculosis, but instead created something far more lasting. Let's begin. Imagine, if you will, a train climbing through the Swiss Alps. It is May of 1912. The narrow gauge railway winds upward through tunnels and across viaducts, the locomotive labouring against the grade. Outside the windows, the world transforms. The green valleys of the lowlands give way to pine forests, then to rocky meadows where the last patches of winter snow still cling to sheltered hollows. The air grows thinner with each passing mile. Passengers who board at Lanquos at the base of the mountains find themselves yawning, their ears popping as the train climbs higher. The ordinary pressure of sea level gives way to something else, something lighter, stranger, more intoxicating. In one of the passenger carriages sits a man of 36. He is impeccably dressed, his moustache carefully groomed, his bearing that of a successful bourgeois gentleman. He carries with him the quiet confidence of someone who has already achieved what he set out to achieve, who has, against considerable odds, made himself into one of the most celebrated authors in the German language. His name is Thomas Mann, and he's travelling to Davos to visit his wife. Katja has been at the Sanatorium since March, nearly 3 months now. Her doctors in Munich had detected what they believed was tuberculosis, and they had recommended the mountain cure, the same cure that Dr. Alexander Spengler had pioneered half a century earlier, the same cure that had transformed this remote valley into one of the most famous medical destinations in the world. Thomas has been worried. He and Katja have been married for 7 years now. They have 4 children, Erika, Klaus, Golo, and Monica, with 2 more still to come. The household in Munich depends on Katja's management. Without her, everything has been more difficult. But it is more than inconvenience that troubles him. It is fear. Tuberculosis kills. It killed Chopin and Keats, the Bronte sisters and Chekhov. It is the White Plague, the captain of death, the disease that has shaped the 19th century more than any other. And now it has come for his wife. He has been at home with the children, writing as he always writes, with the disciplined regularity of a factory worker. Every morning at his desk by 9 o'clock, every afternoon with his correspondence, tea at 4, a walk before dinner, the life of a German author, ordered and productive. But the work has not gone well. He has been distracted, anxious. The letters from Davos bring mixed news. Katja is comfortable, the doctors are optimistic, but the cure takes time, months, perhaps a year or more. And now he is ascending into her world, a world where time moves differently, where the healthy and the sick live side by side, in elegant buildings perched on mountainsides, where conversations about philosophy and death and the meaning of existence fill the long hours between meals. He does not know it yet, but this 3-week visit will change the course of his career. It will give him the setting and the atmosphere for a novel that will consume the next 12 years of his life. It will introduce him to a world suspended between life and death, a world that will prove irresistible to his literary imagination. The train pulls into the station at Davos Platz. The air that greets him as he steps onto the platform is thin and cold and impossibly clear. He can see for miles in every direction, the peaks sharp against the blue sky, the snowfields brilliant in the May sunshine. The altitude hits him immediately. His heart beats faster, his breath comes shorter, colours seem more vivid than they should be. There is something intoxicating about this air, something that makes the ordinary world below seem impossibly distant. Somewhere above him, on one of those elegant terraces, his wife lies wrapped in blankets, breathing this same air, waiting for him to arrive. Thomas Mann has just completed a novella about death and desire in Venice, a story about a celebrated author who travels to a foreign city and falls under a spell from which he cannot escape, a story that ends with a cholera epidemic and a death on the beach. He has come to Davos thinking he might write something similar, a companion piece, a light satirical treatment of the same themes, death and enchantment, but set in a tuberculosis sanatorium rather than a plague-ridden city. Something short, something he can finish in a few months. He has no idea that the short story he's imagining will become a novel of over 1,000 pages. He has no idea that the First World War will erupt before he can finish it. He has no idea that by the time he writes the final sentence, Europe will have torn itself apart. This is his story, and theirs. To to understand Thomas Mann, we must first understand where he came from. He was born on the 6th of June 1875 in the ancient Hanseatic city of Lübeck, a city of brick churches and merchant houses of trading families whose roots stretched back centuries, a city where respectability and commerce and Protestant virtue formed the bedrock of existence. The Hanseatic League had made Lübeck rich. For centuries it had been one of the great trading centres of northern Europe, a city of ships and warehouses, of merchants who grew wealthy on grain and salt and timber. The city's coat of arms proclaimed it the Queen of the Hanse, and even in the late 19th century, long after the League had faded into history, Lübeck's leading families still carried themselves with the dignity of merchant princes. The Mann family was one of these merchant dynasties. His father, Johann Heinrich Mann, was a grain trader and senator of the city, a pillar of the community, respected and prosperous. His grandfather and great-grandfather had been Lübeck citizens before him. The family business, Johann Siegmund Mann, had celebrated its centenary during Thomas's boyhood. The family home stood on the Bäckergrube, one of the finest streets in Lübeck. It was a grand house, filled with heavy furniture and family portraits, with servants and silver and all the trappings of bourgeois success. Young Thomas grew up surrounded by respectability. But his mother was different. Julia da Silva Bruns had been born in Brazil, the daughter of a German plantation owner and a Portuguese Creole mother. She had been brought to Germany at the age of 7, raised by relatives, educated in the European manner. But she carried within her something that her husband's Lübeck relatives never quite understood: a love of music, of art, of the life of feeling rather than commerce. She was beautiful and dark-eyed, with an artist's temperament hidden beneath the proper exterior of a senator's wife. Musicians frequented their house. The piano was never silent for long. The world of art and beauty existed alongside the world of grain prices and merchant ledgers. It was through his mother that the young Thomas Mann was exposed to music, especially the operas of Richard Wagner. He would remember those evenings all his life, the music washing over him, the sense of being transported to another world. Wagner would remain his great passion, his troubling love, the composer whose genius and whose dangerous politics would haunt his work for decades. Thomas was the second son. His older brother Heinrich would also become a writer, and eventually a rival whose political views would lead to years of estrangement. But in childhood, the two boys shared their mother's artistic temperament, her sensitivity, her sense that there was more to life than the counting house. There were also sisters, Julia and Carla, and a younger brother, Victor, but it was Thomas and Heinrich who would carry the family's artistic aspirations into the world. Thomas loathed school. He failed to meet its requirements with what he later described as an innate and paralysing resistance to any external demands. The Catharineum, Lübeck's venerable gymnasium, could make nothing of him. He was not stupid, far from it, but he refused to perform. He dreamed and wrote poetry and waited for his real life to begin. He was designated to take over the family grain firm, but everyone who knew him understood that this was impossible. He was not made for commerce. He was made for something else. The question was whether that something else would ever amount to anything. In 1891, when Thomas was 15, his father died. Senator Mann left careful instructions in his will. The grain business was to be liquidated. He knew his sons. He knew they would never carry on the family tradition. Better to sell than to watch them destroy what generations had built. The family moved to Munich, a centre of art and literature, a city where a young man with artistic ambitions might find his way. Julia Mann took her children south, away from the grey skies and brick churches of Lübeck, into a world of cafes and galleries and bohemian possibility. And find his way Thomas did. The Munich years were formative. He worked briefly at an insurance company, a disaster. He attended lectures at the university, however sporadically. He read voraciously. He wrote stories and sent them to magazines. Slowly, painfully, he learned his craft. He also travelled to Italy with his brother Heinrich, spending months in Rome and Palestine. Italy would become one of his great subjects. The South, the sun, the sensuality that both attracted and frightened his northern Protestant soul. At the age of 26, Thomas Mann published his first novel. It was called Buddenbrooks, and it told the story of the decline of a merchant family in Lübeck over the course of 4 generations. It was, quite openly, the story of his own family, the slow decay of commercial energy, the rise of artistic sensitivity, the transformation from prosperity to decadence. The novel drew on everything he knew: the family home on the Becker Gruber, the senator father with his public dignity and private doubts, the artistic mother who didn't quite belong, the children who couldn't carry on the tradition, the long, slow decline from merchant, vigour to aesthetic refinement to collapse. The Lübeck patricians were not pleased. They recognised themselves in its pages, or thought they did. They called it a scandalous Roman éclat, a betrayal of their caste. For years, Mann would receive angry letters from Lübeck, from people who claimed he had libelled their families. But the rest of Germany embraced it. Buddenbrooks became a bestseller, then a classic. It would eventually help earn its author the Nobel Prize. The young man who had failed at school, who couldn't hold down a job at an insurance company, had written one of the great novels of the German language. By 1912, when Thomas Mann boarded that train to Davos, he was already famous. He had married Katia Pringsheim in 1905, the daughter of a wealthy Munich family, a woman of intelligence and beauty, who would become his lifelong partner and the mother of his 6 children. Katia was remarkable in her own right. Her father was a distinguished mathematician. Her mother came from the wealthy Dome family, known for their progressive politics. Katia herself had been one of the first women to audit university lectures in Munich. She was brilliant, cultured, and devoted to her difficult, demanding husband. He had published short stories and novellas that had established him as a master of German prose. Tonio Kröger, a story about an artist torn between his bourgeois origins and his artistic calling. Tristan, a darkly comic tale set in a sanatorium, a hint of things to come. Most recently, he had completed Death in Venice. This novella told the story of Gustav von Aschenbach, a celebrated writer who travels to Venice and becomes obsessed with a beautiful Polish boy named Tadzio. As Aschenbach's obsession grows, a cholera epidemic sweeps through the city. He refuses to leave, refuses to tear himself away from the object of his desire. Eventually he dies on the beach, watching Tadzio wade into the sea. Death in Venice was partly autobiographical. Mann and his wife had vacationed in Venice the previous year, staying at the Grand Hôtel des Bains on the Lido. There he had encountered a young Polish boy who fascinated him, the same boy who would become Tadzio in the novella. He had also witnessed the early stages of a cholera outbreak. The authorities were covering it up, afraid of scaring away tourists. But the disease was there, lurking in the canals and alleyways. He had turned these experiences into literature, into a meditation on beauty and death, on desire and dissolution. The novella was received as a masterpiece, but Mann was already thinking about his next project, something lighter perhaps, something that would revisit the same themes: enchantment, death, the spell of illness, but in a more satirical mode. He was thinking about tuberculosis, about sanatoriums, about those strange mountain communities where the sick and the healthy live together in a world apart. And now, as the train climbed toward Davos, He was about to experience that world firsthand. The Wald Sanatorium had opened just the year before, in 1911. It was one of the newest and most modern of Davos's many medical institutions, a palace of healing perched on the mountainside above the town. Its director, Dr. Friedrich Jessen, was known for his progressive methods and his belief in the curative power of mountain air. Katja Mann had been among its first patients. She had arrived in March with what doctors believed was tuberculosis. For nearly 3 months she had followed the prescribed regimen: rest on the cure terrace, rich food, hours of stillness in the mountain air. She had written letters to her husband describing daily life in the sanatorium. The meals, 5 enormous meals per day, designed to build up the wasted bodies of the consumptives, the fellow patients, a strange mix of nationalities and temperaments, united only by their illness. The strange atmosphere of a community where death was always present but rarely discussed. These letters are lost now, but their influence remains. They gave Thomas Mann his first glimpse into a world that would obsess him for the next 12 years. A world where time seemed to stand still, where conversations about death were as common as conversations about the weather, where the healthy became infected not just with disease, but with a certain way of thinking, a certain enchantment. When he arrived at the sanatorium in May, Thomas Mann did not simply visit his wife. He immersed himself in the sanatorium life. He sat on the balcony beside her, wrapped in the same kind of camel hair blanket that all the patients used. He breathed the thin, alpine air. He observed the doctors and nurses going about their rounds. He listened to the conversations between patients. He noted the rituals and routines. He absorbed the peculiar atmosphere of this place, what he would later call a mixture of death and amusement. And then, as we have heard, a doctor examined him and found a moist spot on his lung. Would he like to stay for 3 months? Would he like to take the cure himself? Thomas Mann said no. He had children waiting for him in Munich, books to write, a life to live. He could not surrender to the mountain spell, however seductive it might be. But the question stayed with him. What if he had said yes? What if he had surrendered? What if he had stayed? The novel he would write imagined the answer. The novel that Thomas Mann began writing in 1913 opens with a young man on a train. His name is Hans Castorp. He's 23 years old, an engineer from Hamburg, and he is travelling to the Swiss Alps to visit his cousin Joachim Siemsen. Joachim has been at the Berghof Sanatorium for several months, being treated for tuberculosis. Hans plans to stay for 3 weeks, just long enough to keep his cousin company, before returning to the flatlands to begin his career. 3 weeks, 21 days, a brief interruption in the orderly progression of a young bourgeois life. Hans will visit, he will rest, he will breathe the famous mountain air, and then he will descend to the real world below, to engineering projects and business concerns and all the productive activities of modern life. This is what Hans believes. This is what the reader believes, at least at first. But the mountain has other plans. Mann introduces his protagonist with careful irony. Hans Castorp is ordinary, thoroughly, deliberately ordinary. He is not particularly intelligent or gifted. He has no great passions, no burning ambitions. He is simply a young man of his class and time, a product of Hamburg's merchant culture, destined to build ships and make money and live the respectable life his family expects. He has recently passed his engineering exams and is about to take a position at the shipyard of Thunder and Wilms. Everything is prepared. His future is mapped out. All he needs to do is follow the path that has been laid before him. But first, this brief holiday in the mountains. 3 weeks to visit his cousin, 3 weeks to see the sanatorium that everyone talks about, 3 weeks to breathe the famous air. The journey itself is significant. Mann devotes pages to Hans's ascent from the flatlands to the mountain. The train climbs and climbs. The air grows thinner. The landscape becomes more dramatic. It is as though Hans is travelling not just to a different place, but to a different world entirely. From the moment Hans arrives, something is different. The air is thinner, his heart beats faster. Colours seem more vivid, sounds more distinct. Even time itself seems to move differently. The hours stretch and compress in ways that the flatlands never permitted. His cousin Joachim meets him at the station. Joachim is a soldier, or would be, if only he could get well. His greatest desire is to leave the sanatorium, to descend to the flatlands, to begin his military career. But the doctors keep finding reasons for him to stay. His fever persists. His lungs are not yet healed. Just a few more months, they tell him. Just a little longer. Hans is struck by how natural this all seems to Joachim. The routine of the sanatorium has become his cousin's entire world. The morning rest cure, the 5 enormous meals per day, the temperature taking, the x-rays, the consultations with doctors. Joachim speaks of these things as if they were the normal substance of existence. And indeed, at the Berghof they are. The sanatorium itself is like a grand hotel perched on the mountainside with views in every direction. It has elegant public rooms and private balconies, a library and a dining room, gardens and walking paths. The patients live in comfort, even luxury. But beneath the elegance lies the ever-present reality of illness and death. Hans is shown to his room, a pleasant chamber with a balcony overlooking the valley. The furniture is solid and comfortable. The walls are thick enough to muffle the sounds of the neighbouring patients. It could be a room in any good hotel. Except that the room's previous occupant died here just 2 days ago. The sheets have been changed and the room has been aired, but the death still lingers somehow. It is the first of many deaths that Hans will encounter at the Berghof. The sanatorium has its own customs, its own hierarchies, its own way of measuring time. New patients are called horizontal. They must spend their days lying on the cure terraces, forbidden from walking or exerting themselves. More advanced patients are granted increasing freedoms, allowed to walk in the gardens, to take excursions into the surrounding mountains. But no one, it seems, ever truly leaves, or if they do, they often return. The mountain has a way of claiming its own. Hans meets the chief physician, Hofrat Behrens, a tall, melancholic, wryly humorous man who has lived at the sanatorium for years. Behrens' own wife died here of tuberculosis, and he stayed on when he discovered that he too was infected. Now he presides over this community of the sick with a mixture of professional competence and dark humour. Behrens paints in his spare time, portraits of the patients mostly. He has painted Klavdia Shosha, the Russian woman who will become Hans's obsession. His medical eye and his artist eye see the same things: the signs of illness, the pallor of the skin, the particular beauty that consumption sometimes gives its victims. There is also Dr. Krakowski, who handles the psychological aspects of treatment. He is a bearded man with a penetrating gaze, given to wearing sandals and speaking in suggestive terms about the unconscious. He believes that illness has its roots in repressed desires, that physical disease is often the manifestation of psychological conflict. His lectures are well attended by the patients, who have little else to occupy their time. The lectures are about love, mostly, about the hidden workings of desire and repression. The patients listen, fascinated and uncomfortable, wondering what their own illnesses might reveal about their secret selves. Hans intends to observe all of this as an outsider. He is healthy after all. He is just visiting. In 3 weeks he will return to Hamburg, to his uncle's shipping firm, to the life that awaits him in the flatlands. But on the very first evening, something happens. During dinner, he notices a woman across the dining room. She has high cheekbones, slightly slanted eyes, and a peculiar habit of letting doors slam behind her. Her name is Klavdia Shausha. She's Russian, married but alone, and she has been at the sanatorium on and off for years. Hans watches her. He cannot stop watching her. There is something about her face, something about the way she moves, that reminds him of someone from his past. A boy named Pribislav Hipper from his school days, a friend with whom he shared a single charged encounter. He does not understand this fascination. He does not want to understand it. But from this moment forward, Klavdia Shausha will become his obsession. And then, within days of his arrival, Hans develops symptoms. A cold, perhaps, a mild infection. His face feels flushed. His heartbeat is irregular. There is a strange taste in his mouth, the taste of blood, perhaps, though he cannot be sure. Hofrat Behrens examines him and discovers what the real Thomas Mann's doctor had discovered in 1912, a moist spot on his lung. Would Hans like to stay for treatment? Would he like to take the cure? Unlike Thomas Mann, Hans Castorp says yes. What does it mean to stay on the mountain? The first thing Hans discovers is that time moves differently here. In the flatlands, time is marked by activity, by work and appointments, and the forward progress of a career. But at the Berghof, there is no work to be done. The patient's only job is to rest, to eat, to breathe, to wait. The days blur together. Monday becomes indistinguishable from Wednesday. The weeks accumulate without marking. The seasons change. Summer gives way to autumn, autumn to the deep snows of winter. But the routine remains constant. Rest cure at 9, lunch at noon, rest cure at 2, dinner at 7. The same balcony, the same blankets, the same view of the mountains. Thomas Mann called his novel a Zeitraman, a novel about time. Not just because it was set in a particular historical era, but because time itself is the novel's subject. The sanatorium exists outside of ordinary time. It is a place where the normal rules do not apply. The novel's structure mirrors this distortion. The first day at the Berghof takes over 100 pages to describe. The second day takes almost as long, but later, entire years pass in a single chapter. Time expands and contracts according to the logic of experience rather than the clock. Hans begins to lose track of how long he has been at the Berghof. Was it 3 weeks, 3 months, longer? His letters home grow less frequent. His thoughts of Hamburg, of his engineering career, of the life that awaits him in the flatlands grow dimmer and more distant. The mountain is casting its spell. Part of this spell is the routine itself. The 5 meals per day are enormous, intended to build up the wasted bodies of the consumptives, to provide the calories needed to fight the disease. Breakfast, second breakfast, lunch, tea, dinner, rich foods, heavy foods, milk and eggs and butter and meat. The patients eat and rest, their bodies growing softer even as their lungs struggle to heal. There is something almost obscene about this abundance of food in the midst of wasting disease. But the logic is medical. The body needs fuel to fight the bacillus. Part of the spell is the enforced stillness. During the rest cure, patients are forbidden to read, to talk, to do anything that might agitate the mind or body. They must simply lie there, wrapped in blankets against the mountain cold, breathing the thin air, staring at the sky. And part of the spell is the obsession with symptoms. Every patient takes their temperature multiple times daily, keeping the thermometer in their mouth for exactly 7 minutes, One of many sevens that recur throughout the novel, every fluctuation is noted, analysed, discussed. A rise of a few tenths of a degree becomes a matter of intense concern. A decline is cause for celebration. The body becomes the sole focus of attention. Normal life, with its distractions and diversions, falls away. There is only the body, the temperature, the hope of healing. Hans finds himself drawn into this obsession. He purchases his own thermometer, an expensive precision instrument, and monitors his temperature with growing fascination. He learns to read the subtle signs of his body, to interpret every flush and chill. His moist spot becomes the centre of his existence. But is he really sick? This is the question that hovers over the novel, just as it hovered over Katja Mann's actual diagnosis. The doctors at the Berghof find evidence of illness. They prescribe treatment. They find reasons for Hans to stay. But the reader begins to wonder whether the illness is real, or whether it is an excuse, a reason to stay on the mountain, to escape the demands of life below. Perhaps Hans wants to be sick. Perhaps illness is a form of freedom. For there is something seductive about illness, something liberating about being excused from the normal obligations of existence. At the Berghof, Hans has no responsibilities, no work to complete, no career to build. He can spend his days in contemplation, in conversation, in the slow accumulation of experience. The German word for this state is Krankheit, sickness. But there is another word that applies, Versuchung, temptation. The sanatorium offers the temptation of withdrawal, of escape from life's demands. It is a temptation that many of the patients have succumbed to. The flatlands come to seem impossibly distant. When letters arrive from Hamburg, they feel like messages from another world, a world of commerce and industry and practical concerns, a world where time marches forward, where things get done, where life has purpose and direction. His uncle writes, asking about his plans. His friends write, wondering when he will return. The engineering firm writes, reminding him that his position cannot be held indefinitely. But these communications seem increasingly irrelevant. They belong to a life that Hans is no longer sure he wants. But on the mountain, there is no forward movement. There is only the eternal present of the cure. There is only the routine, the meals, the rest cure, the conversations, the temperature taking. There is only the waiting. 3 weeks becomes 3 months. 3 months becomes a year. Hans stops mentioning his departure date. He stops thinking about Hamburg. The mountain has claimed him. This is the enchantment that Thomas Mann experienced during his 3-week visit in 1912. He could have stayed. The doctor had invited him to stay. He had felt the mountain's pull, the seductive promise of illness, the strange peace of a world where normal life was suspended. He chose to leave. His character does not. And in not leaving, Hans Castorp opens himself to experiences that would never have been possible in the flatlands. He opens himself to philosophy, to ideas, to the great debates that will consume the rest of the novel. He opens himself to questions about life and death, about the meaning of existence, about the nature of time itself. He opens himself to love and to death. If time is the novel's structure, ideas are its substance. Hans Castorp arrives at the Berghof as an ordinary young man, well-meaning but intellectually unremarkable. He has received the standard education of his class, but he has never thought deeply about philosophy or politics or the meaning of existence. He has accepted the world as he found it. The mountain will change this. His first educator is Lodovico Settembrini, an Italian man of letters who has been at the sanatorium for years. Settembrini is a humanist, an apostle of the Enlightenment, a believer in reason and progress and the dignity of man. He speaks in elaborate, beautifully constructed sentences. He quotes the classics. He sees himself as a representative of civilization itself. Settembrini comes from a distinguished Italian family. His grandfather fought with Mazzini for Italian unification. His father was a classical scholar and freethinker. Settembrini himself works on a great encyclopedia of suffering, a catalogue of all the ways that human beings have been oppressed and tortured throughout history, compiled in order to prevent such suffering from ever happening again. He is, in his way, an idealist. He believes that education can improve humanity. He believes that reason can triumph over superstition. He believes that the future will be better than the past. Settembrini takes Hans under his wing. He warns him about the dangers of the mountain, not just the physical dangers of tuberculosis, but the spiritual dangers of enchantment. The sanatorium, Settembrini believes, encourages a kind of moral lassitude. It makes people fall in love with death rather than life. It seduces them away from the active, productive existence that gives human life its meaning. Flee this place, Settembrini urges. Return to the flatlands. Take up your work, your career, your responsibilities. Do not let the mountain claim you. His favourite word is placet, the Latin for it is pleasing. It pleases him when Hans shows signs of intellectual awakening. It displeases him when Hans falls under the mountain's spell. Hans listens, fascinated. He has never met anyone like Settembrini. No one who speaks with such passion about ideas, who sees the world as a battleground of competing philosophies. The Italian opens doors in Hans's mind that have never been opened before. But he does not flee. He stays. And in staying, he encounters Settembrini's opposite. Leo Nafta is a Jew who has converted to Catholicism and been educated by the Jesuits. His story is extraordinary. Born into poverty in a Galician village, he witnessed his father's murder by a pogrom when he was a child. The Jesuits took him in, educated him, converted him. Now he lives in Davos, too ill to continue his work as a teacher, but still formidably intelligent. Where Settembrini represents the Enlightenment, Nafta represents its opposite: authority, tradition, the rejection of humanist optimism. He believes that the modern world has lost its way, that reason without faith leads to chaos, that humanity needs the discipline of absolute truth. He is small, sharp-featured, and dressed always in elegant black. His rooms are filled with religious art, a pieta, crucifixes, images of suffering and martyrdom. He takes a dark pleasure in argument, in reducing his opponents to confusion and despair. The two men despise each other. Settembrini calls Nafta a terrorist and a nihilist. Nafta calls Settembrini a windbag and a fool. They cannot be in the same room without arguing. And yet they are drawn together, locked in endless debates that Hans witnesses with growing fascination. These debates form the intellectual heart of the novel. Settembrini argues for democracy, for tolerance, for human rights. Nafta argues for hierarchy, for discipline, for the submission of the individual to higher powers. They debate war and peace, art and commerce, life and death. What is progress? Settembrini believes in it absolutely. The forward march of reason, the gradual improvement of humanity. Nafta calls this a delusion. History is not a line but a circle. Civilizations rise and fall. The idea that modern humanity is superior to its ancestors is merely arrogance. What is freedom? For Settembrini, it is the highest value, the right of individuals to determine their own destinies. For Nafta, it is a curse. Freedom without guidance leads only to chaos and despair. Human beings need discipline, hierarchy, truth imposed from above. Neither wins, neither can win. That is the point. Thomas Mann wrote much of this material during the First World War, when the ideas that Settembrini and NAFTA represent were tearing Europe apart. The novel became a battlefield for the same conflicts that were playing out in the trenches of France and Belgium. Reason versus tradition. Progress versus authority. The Enlightenment versus its enemies. Mann's own sympathies were complicated. At the start of the war, he had sided against the Enlightenment. He had written essays defending German culture against what he saw as the shallow rationalism of the West. He had quarrelled bitterly with his brother Heinrich, who supported the democracies. But as the war dragged on, as the carnage mounted, his views began to shift. The novel reflects this internal struggle. Neither Settembrini nor NAFTA is simply right or wrong. Both articulate genuine insights. Both are also deeply flawed. Settembrini's humanism can seem naive and self-satisfied. His faith in progress seems increasingly hollow in a world preparing for industrial slaughter. NAFTA's authoritarianism leads ultimately to nihilism, a worship of death that negates everything he claims to believe. Hans listens to them both. He absorbs their arguments. He is educated by their conflict. But he's never simply a student. The novel's great achievement is that Hans Castorp, this ordinary young man, this unremarkable engineer from Hamburg, becomes wiser than his teachers. He finds a position between their extremes, a synthesis that neither of them can achieve. This synthesis will be articulated most clearly in the novel's central chapter, a chapter called Snow. But before we reach that moment, we must speak of love. For Hans's education is not only intellectual, it is also emotional, and at its centre is Klavdia Chochal. For months, Hans watches Klavdia from across the dining room. He does not speak to her. He does not introduce himself. The social conventions of the sanatorium do not permit such forwardness. Patients are introduced formally or not at all. A young German engineer cannot simply approach a married Russian woman and declare his interest. So, he watches. He learns her schedule. He positions himself where he will see her. In the dining room, in the corridors, in the gardens. He becomes, in his quiet way, obsessed. What is it about her? She is not conventionally beautiful. Her face is too broad, her cheekbones too pronounced. She has what the Germans call Kyrgyz eyes, slightly slanted, suggesting something Asiatic, something foreign, something other. And yet Hans cannot look away. There is something about her face, something about the way she moves that holds him captive. It is as though he has known her before, in some previous life or some forgotten dream. He realizes, gradually, what this feeling means. Klavdia reminds him of someone, a boy named Pribislav Hipper whom he knew in school, a boy with the same Kyrgyz eyes, the same high cheekbones, a boy with whom he shared a single, charged encounter. This is one of the novel's most daring elements. Hans's love for Klavdia is bound up with a memory of boyhood desire, of feelings that were never acknowledged or expressed. He once borrowed a pencil from Pribislav Hipper, and the exchange was invested with an intensity that he never understood and never forgot. The mountain, which suspends normal rules of time, also suspends normal rules of propriety. It allows Hans to feel things that Hamburg would never have permitted. It allows him to acknowledge desires that the flatlands would have kept hidden. Settembrini warns him. Stay away from the Asiatic, he says, using a word that reveals his own prejudices. He sees Klavdia as a representative of everything he opposes, the irrational, the sensual, the Eastern. She is disorder in female form. She is ill, he says. She is soft, she is lax. She lets doors slam behind her because she has no discipline, no self-control. She will drag you down into her softness. Hans cannot stay away. He borrows a pencil from her, an act that echoes his long-ago encounter with Pribislav Hipper. He learns her routines. He listens for the sound of her door slamming. He becomes, in his quiet way, her devotee. And then comes carnival night. Once a year the Berghof celebrates Fasching, the carnival that precedes Lent. Patients don costumes and masks. The normal hierarchies are suspended. Wine flows freely. For one night, everyone pretends to be someone else. It is a dangerous night. The sick pretend to be healthy. The proper pretend to be wild. Rules that govern daily life are temporarily suspended. Anything might happen. Hans approaches Klavdia at last. They speak. He uses the intimate form of address, du rather than sie, a liberty that would be unthinkable under normal circumstances. In German, to use du with a stranger is either an insult or an intimacy. Hans means it as intimacy. They speak in French, neither's native language, but a language in which difficult things might be said more easily. Hans tells her of his love, of his months of watching, of the dreams that have consumed him. She is not surprised. She has known. Perhaps she has been waiting. That night they consummate their passion. The details are not given. Mann was a discreet writer, and the scene unfolds largely through implication, but the implication is clear. Hans enters her room. He does not leave until morning. It is the only night they will have. The next morning, Klavdia leaves the sanatorium. She has been planning this departure for weeks. She returns to her husband, to whatever life awaits her in Russia. She leaves Hans only a memento, an X-ray photograph of her diseased lungs, which he will treasure like a love token. Hans is devastated, but he does not follow her. He does not leave the mountain. Instead, he waits. He waits for 3 more years. This is the strange mathematics of love on the mountain. One night becomes an eternity. 3 years of waiting become a mere interlude. Time stretches and compresses according to its own logic. During these years, Hans continues his education. He reads books from the sanatorium library, books on anatomy, on physiology, on the nature of life itself. He listens to the debates between Settembrini and Nafta. He observes the other patients, watching as some recover and descend to the flatlands, watching as others decline and die. His cousin Joachim finally leaves. He can wait no longer for the doctor's permission. He descends to the flatlands, takes up his military career, becomes the soldier he always wanted to be. But the mountain is not finished with him. Within months, Joachim returns. His illness has flared again. This time there will be no recovery. Hans watches his cousin die, watches him slip away in a scene of terrible pathos, still trying to salute, still the soldier at the end. It is the death that affects Hans most deeply. Joachim was his connection to the flatlands, his link to normal life. With Joachim gone, the mountain's hold on Hans is complete. And then, years after her departure, Klavdia Chosha returns. But she is not alone. The man who accompanies Klavdia is unlike anyone Hans has encountered at the Berghof. His name is Mynheer Peperkorn. He is Dutch, a former coffee planter from Java, and he is enormously wealthy. He is also old, sick, and possessed of a personality so overwhelming that everyone around him is drawn into his orbit like planets around a sun. Peperkorn is massive, a great bear of a man with a leonine head and piercing eyes. He dominates every room he enters, not through force or aggression, but through sheer presence. When he speaks, everyone listens, even though he rarely finishes a sentence. This is the strangest thing about him. Peppercorn cannot complete a thought. His speech trails off into fragments, into gestures, into inarticulate but somehow eloquent silences. He raises a finger, makes a gesture, and everyone nods as though he has said something profound. Life, gentlemen, he begins. Life is, that is to say, and in short, but enough. And somehow this is enough. His presence fills in what his words leave out. Where Settembrini and NAFTA are all words, all ideas, Peppercorn is pure life force. He represents something that cannot be captured in arguments or philosophies, the irrational vitality that makes existence worthwhile. Thomas Mann based this character partly on Gerhard Hauptmann, a famous German poet whom Mann both admired and resented. Hauptmann was a towering figure in German letters, a Nobel laureate, a literary celebrity, a man who commanded attention wherever he went. But Mann found him intellectually disappointing, a great presence with little substance. The portrait in the novel is affectionate but also satirical. Peppercorn is magnificent but also absurd, a giant who cannot express the simplest thought. He is the critic's nightmare, a man who cannot be analysed because there is nothing to analyse, only presence. Hans should hate him. This is the man who has taken Klavdia. This is his rival. For 3 years Hans has waited for her return, dreaming of their one night together, treasuring the X-ray of her lungs, and now she returns on the arm of another man. But Hans finds himself drawn to Peppercorn instead. The two men become friends. They drink together. Peppercorn drinks enormously, a connoisseur of wines and liquors. They talk, or rather Peppercorn speaks in fragments while Hans listens, trying to decipher meaning from gesture and intonation. There is something generous in this friendship. Hans has learned during his years on the mountain to set aside jealousy. He has learned that love is not possession, that people cannot be owned. Klavdia belongs to no one, not even to herself. She moves through life like a force of nature, taking and leaving as the spirit moves her. Or perhaps it is simpler. Perhaps Peppercorn is simply impossible to resist. His personality is a force of nature, as irresistible as gravity. Even Settembrini and NAFTA fall silent in his presence, their arguments suddenly seeming petty and abstract. But Peppercorn is dying. The vitality that animates him is flickering. He feels it failing, feels himself becoming impotent, a word that has both sexual and existential meaning. He can no longer be the life force he has always been. His body is betraying him, his spirit is dimming. He speaks of this to Hans, in his fragmentary way. The greatest sin, he says, is failure of feeling. To be alive and not feel alive, this is the unforgivable thing. Better to die than to lose the capacity for life. One day, he gathers a small group of friends for a picnic by a waterfall. It is a beautiful day. The water crashes over the rocks. Nature displays itself in all its overwhelming power. Peppercorn leads them to the waterfall's edge and begins to speak, but the roar of the water drowns out his words. No one can hear him. His gestures become more and more emphatic, but his voice is lost in the thunder of the cascade. It is perhaps the perfect image of his life. All presence, no content. All gesture, no words. Magnificent and absurd at once. That night Peppercorn kills himself. He has chosen to end his life while he still can, before the vitality drains away completely. It is an act of will, a final assertion of control over a body that has begun to betray him. He uses a clever device of his own invention, a kind of spring-loaded poison needle. Even his death is elaborate. theatrical. Hans grieves, Klavdia grieves, and then, once again, she leaves. This time, Hans knows she will not return. This time, he does not wait. Before Pieperkorn's arrival, before Klavdia's return, there is a moment that stands at the centre of the novel. Hans has taken up skiing. It is one of the few physical activities permitted to the patients, a way to exercise the lungs in the cold mountain air. Day after day, he ventures into the snowfields above the sanatorium, exploring the wilderness that surrounds the Berghof. The skiing is solitary and meditative. Hans glides across the snow, alone with his thoughts, the sanatorium shrinking to a speck below him. Up here, the debates of Settembrini and NAFTA seem very far away. There is only the snow and the sky and the rhythm of his movements. One afternoon he goes too far. A storm blows in without warning. Within minutes he is lost in a whiteout, unable to see more than a few feet in any direction, unable to find his way back to the sanatorium. He skis in circles, though he does not know it. The storm grows worse. His strength begins to fail. The cold seeps into his bones. He knows, with growing certainty, that he is going to die. He takes shelter against a hay barn, a rough structure used by farmers in summer, now half buried in snow. He sits there, his back against the wooden wall, feeling the cold claim him. He is dying. He knows this. The cold is too intense, the storm too severe. No one knows where he has gone. He will freeze to death within hours. And as he sits there, waiting for death, he falls asleep. He dreams. The dream is the most remarkable passage in the novel. It is the moment toward which everything has been building. The synthesis that Hans achieves, the wisdom that goes beyond both Settembrini and NAFTA. At first, Hans finds himself on a Mediterranean shore. The sun is warm, the sea is blue. Beautiful people move through a classical landscape. Young men and women of perfect form, engaged in games and conversations and gentle love. It is paradise. It is everything the mountain is not. He sees children playing on the sand. He sees mothers nursing infants. He sees old people sitting in the shade, watching the young with benevolent eyes. It is a vision of human life as it might be, harmonious, beautiful, at peace with itself. But the dream changes. Hans is drawn toward a temple at the edge of the landscape. It stands apart from the sunny scenes below, its columns casting deep shadows. Something compels him to enter, something he does not understand. Inside he finds something terrible. Two old women crouch over a child. They are tearing it apart, they are eating its flesh. Blood stains their mouths, their hands, the floor beneath them. The horror is indescribable. Hans wants to flee, wants to wake, wants to unsee what he has seen. But he cannot move. He can only watch as the hags continue their terrible feast. And then he understands. The beautiful people outside know about this horror. It is part of their world. They live their graceful, harmonious lives in full knowledge of the temple and what happens within it. The paradise and the horror exist together, inseparable. Hans wakes from this vision with a single insight. It is the most important sentence in the novel, set in space type in the German original, to emphasize its significance. For the sake of goodness and love, man shall let death have no sovereignty over his thoughts. This is Hans's synthesis. This is what he has learned from Settembrini and NAFTA, from Klavdia and Pieperkorn, from all his years on the mountain. Death is real. Horror is real. The temple and its horrors cannot be denied or wished away. But life must not be governed by them. Love must not be conquered by them. We must acknowledge death and still choose life. We must know the horror and still act with goodness and love. The storm clears. Hans finds his way back to the sanatorium. He has survived. But here is the strange thing. Within days, Hans forgets his vision. The insight fades. The words that seemed so clear in the snow become confused and uncertain in the warmth of the Berghof. The mountain reclaims him. Its spell is unbroken. This forgetting is perhaps the most honest thing in the novel. Epiphanies rarely last. Insights fade. We return to our habitual ways of being, even when we have glimpsed something higher. The vision in the snow was real, but it could not survive the return to ordinary life. Hans will not remember his vision when he needs it most. Let us step back from the novel for a moment and consider the real Davos, the town that Thomas Mann visited in 1912, the place that would become the Berghof in his imagination. Davos sits at an altitude of 1,500 metres in the Graubünden Alps, high enough that the air is thin and cold, low enough that life is still possible. In the 19th century it was a small farming community, its people scraping a living from the rocky soil and sparse pastures. Everything changed when Dr. Alexander Spengler arrived. If you have travelled with us before to Davos, to the episode about that alpine town that tuberculosis built, you know Spengler's story. He was a German doctor who came to Davos in 1853, suffering from tuberculosis himself. The mountain air seemed to help him. He began to wonder if it might help others. Spengler became convinced that the particular combination of altitude, dry air and sunshine in Davos could benefit tubercular patients. He began recommending it to his patients. Others followed. By the 1860s, the first sanatoriums were being built. The Davos that Thomas Mann visited in 1912 was the product of this medical gold rush. The town had been transformed. Where once there were scattered farmhouses, now there were grand sanatoriums, buildings like ocean liners run aground on the mountainside, their balconies facing south to catch the sun. The Schatzalp, opened in 1900, was one of the grandest. Built in the Art Nouveau style, it, perched on a ridge above the town, accessible only by funicular railway. Its patients were wealthy, its facilities luxurious. It is the model for Mann's fictional Berghof. The Wald-Sanatorium, where Katja actually stayed, was newer, opened just in 1911. It was a forest sanatorium, set among pine trees on the mountainside above the town. Its director, Dr. Friedrich Jessen, was known for his modern methods. Life in these sanatoriums followed a strict routine. Patients spent hours each day on the cure terrace, lying in reclining chairs, wrapped in blankets, breathing the cold mountain air. They ate enormous meals, 5 per day, rich in fats and proteins, designed to build up their wasted bodies. They took their temperature obsessively. They submitted to X-rays and examinations. They lived suspended between hope and fear, never knowing whether they would recover or decline. The sanatoriums were also social worlds. Patients came from across Europe, from Germany and Russia, from England and France, from Italy and Austria. They were thrown together by their illness, united by their common fate. Romances flourished, friendships formed. The boundary between patient and visitor, between sick and healthy, was permeable and uncertain. Mann captured all of this in his novel. The 5 meals per day, the cure terraces, the obsessive temperature taking, the strange society of the sick. But he transformed it too, making the sanatorium into a symbol of something larger, a microcosm of European civilization before the catastrophe. By 1912, that catastrophe was only 2 years away. The world that Mann observed at the Wald Sanatorium, the elegant society of the sick, the debates between humanists and authoritarians, the enchantment with death was about to be swept away by war. The sanatoriums themselves would survive for another 4 decades, until antibiotics made the mountain cure obsolete. But the world they represented, the world of pre-war Europe, with its certainties and its illusions, would end in August of 1914. Mann did not know this when he visited. He could not have known. But by the time he finished his novel 12 years later, the catastrophe had happened. The novel that began as satire had become prophecy. We must now consider the man behind the novel, consider the circumstances in which it was written. Thomas Mann began writing The Magic Mountain in 1913, just over a year after his visit to Davos. He intended it to be a short satirical piece, a companion to death in Venice, exploring similar themes in a more humorous mode. Perhaps 100 pages, perhaps he could finish it in a year. Then, in the summer of 1914, the world exploded. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo set in motion a chain of events that would destroy the Europe Thomas Mann had known. Austria declared war on Serbia, Russia mobilized, Germany declared war on Russia and France. Britain entered the conflict. Within weeks, millions of men were marching toward trenches where they would die in numbers that defied comprehension. Mann, like many German intellectuals, initially supported the war. He saw it as a defense of German culture against what he perceived as the shallow materialism of the West. Germany represented depth, inwardness, the life of the spirit. France and England represented surface, commerce, the life of mere reason. This is a position that seems incomprehensible now, but it was common among German intellectuals in 1914. They believed that German culture was superior to Western civilization, that Germany represented something deeper and more authentic than the democracies of the West. Mann threw himself into this argument. He wrote essays defending Germany, defending the war, defending what he saw as German values. He quarrelled bitterly with his brother Heinrich, who opposed the war and embraced the democratic values of France. The brothers stopped speaking. Their estrangement would last for years. It was a painful rupture. 2 brothers who had grown up together, who had shared their mother's artistic temperament, now divided by politics and war. And still Mann worked on his novel, though the work was interrupted constantly. He wrote political essays, gave speeches, engaged in the conflicts of the day. The Magic Mountain lay unfinished, its characters frozen on their mountain while Europe burned. The war dragged on, 4 years that seemed like 40. The trenches became charnel houses. The dead piled up in numbers that numbed the mind. 10 million soldiers would die, 20 million more would be wounded. The flower of a generation was destroyed. By the time the war ended in 1918, everything had changed. The German Empire had fallen. Revolution had swept through the country. The old certainties had been swept away. Mann's own views had begun to shift. The carnage of the war had shaken his confidence in German exceptionalism. The failure of the old order made him reconsider his opposition to democracy. Slowly, painfully, he was coming to see that his position had been wrong. When he returned to the novel, he brought these new perspectives with him. The Magic Mountain became not just a story about a young man in a sanatorium, but an allegory for European civilization itself, a civilization that had been enchanted by dangerous ideas, that had fallen under the spell of death, that had descended into the madness of war. Once. The debates between Settembrini and NAFTA took on new meaning. They were no longer abstract philosophical discussions. They were the ideas that had torn Europe apart. The novel's final pages are among the strangest in literature. For 7 years, Hans Castorp has lived on the mountain. 7 years of rest, cures and debates, of love and death, of time suspended. 7 years while the world below prepared for catastrophe. And then, in August of 1914, the spell breaks. The word comes up the mountain. War has been declared. The European powers are mobilizing. Young men are needed to fight. The sanatorium empties. Patients who have been too sick to leave suddenly find themselves cured, or cured enough to fight. The debates between Settembrini and NAFTA reach their terrible conclusion. They quarrel, they challenge each other to a duel, and NAFTA, in a final gesture of nihilism, shoots himself rather than his opponent. Hans descends. After 7 years, he finally leaves the Berghof. Not because he is cured. We never know whether his illness was real. Not because he has chosen to leave. He could have stayed. He descends because history has summoned him. The final scene finds him on a battlefield somewhere in Flanders. Shells are falling. Men are dying around him. He stumbles forward through the mud and smoke, singing a German song. A love song, oddly, in the midst of all this death. The song is The Linden Tree from Schubert's Winterreise, a song about rest, about the tree that promises peace, about the traveller who is tempted to stop and sleep forever. It is a song about death, and Hans sings it as he marches toward what may be his own death. Thomas Mann does not tell us what happens next. The novel ends with Hans disappearing into the chaos of battle. Will he survive? The narrator offers little hope. Adventures of the flesh and in the spirit, while enhancing thy simplicity, granted thee to know in the spirit what in the flesh thou scarcely could have done. Moments there were, when out of death and the rebellion of the flesh, there came to thee as thou tookest stock of thyself a dream of love. Out of this universal feast of death, out of this extremity of fever, kindling the rain-washed evening sky to a fiery glow, may it be that love one day shall mount. The World Festival of Death. This is Mann's phrase for the war. The war that ended the world he had known. The war that killed millions. The war that made the enchantments of the sanatorium seem almost innocent by comparison. Hans Castorp, who spent 7 years learning to think about death, now faces death itself, not as philosophy but as artillery shells and poison gas and bodies piled in, trenches. The abstract debates of Settembrini and NAFTA have become horribly concrete. It is an extraordinary ending, frustrating for readers who want resolution, who want to know whether Hans lives or dies, but true to the novel's vision. The mountain protected its patients from the world, but the world eventually comes for everyone. The enchantment ends, the spell breaks, history claims its own. Thomas Mann finished The Magic Mountain in the summer of 1924. He had worked on it for over 12 years, longer than Hans Castorp spent at the Berghof. The novel that began as a short satire had grown into over 1,000 pages, one of the longest and most complex works of German literature. He was pessimistic about its reception. Germany in 1924 was a wounded nation, defeated in war, convulsed by revolution, devastated by hyperinflation. The economy was only beginning to stabilise. Hitler had just been released from prison after his failed beer hall putsch. Would anyone have the patience for a 1,200-page meditation on time and death? Would anyone expect, Mann wrote, that a harassed public, economically oppressed, would take it on itself to pursue through 1,200 pages the dreamlike ramifications of this figment of thought? The answer surprised him. The Magic Mountain was an immediate success. The first printing sold out almost immediately. Critics hailed it as a masterpiece. Readers devoured it despite its length and difficulty. Within months, it was clear that Mann had written something that would endure. The novel spoke to its moment. The Europe of 1924 was living in the aftermath of the catastrophe that the novel predicted. Readers recognised their world in Mann's pages, the intellectual conflicts, the seductions of death, the enchantments that had led to disaster. The book was both diagnosis and autopsy, explaining how the catastrophe had happened even as it mourned what had been lost. But the novel also transcended its moment. Its themes were universal enough to speak to readers in any era. Time and death, love and illness, the tension between life's demands and the desire to withdraw from them. These are permanent human concerns not bound to any particular place or time. In 1929, Thomas Mann was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. The Swedish Academy cited Buddenbrooks as the primary reason for the award, but everyone understood that the Magic Mountain had sealed his reputation. He was now officially one of the greatest writers in the German language. The prize ceremony was held in Stockholm in December. Mann gave his acceptance speech in German, speaking of the relationship between art and democracy, between literature and politics. He was beginning to engage more openly with political questions that would consume the rest of his life. He used the prize money to build a summer cottage in Lithuania, on the Curonian Spit, a narrow strip of land between the Baltic Sea and the Curonian Lagoon. There, in a simple wooden house overlooking the dunes, he worked on his next great project, the tetralogy Joseph and his Brothers, which would occupy him for the next 16 years. But the Magic Mountain remained his central achievement. When readers thought of Thomas Mann, they thought of the Sanatorium, the Cure terraces, the debates between Settembrini and NAFTA, Hans Castorp, lost in the snow, glimpsing a truth he could not hold. The mountain had claimed not only Hans but his creator, and through his creation it had claimed millions of readers as well. The 1920s were good years for Thomas Mann. He was wealthy, famous, honoured. He lived in a grand house in Munich with his wife and 6 children. He travelled, lectured, received prizes and honorary degrees. He was by any measure a successful man. But storm clouds were gathering. The Weimar Republic, the democratic government that had replaced the Kaiser after the war, was struggling. Economic instability, political extremism, the humiliation of the Versailles Treaty. All of these undermined confidence in the democratic order. The Republic had enemies on all sides. And a new political movement was rising. The National Socialists, led by Adolf Hitler, offered a vision of national renewal that appealed to many Germans. They promised to restore Germany's greatness, to avenge the defeat of the war, to build a new Reich that would last 1,000 years. Thomas Mann watched this rise with growing alarm. His political views had evolved since the war. He had come to see democracy not as a foreign imposition, but as the best hope for German civilization. He had reconciled with his brother Heinrich. He had begun to speak out against the forces that threatened to destroy everything he valued. In 1930 he gave a speech in Berlin. He called it an appeal to reason. It was a plea for the educated middle class and the working class to unite against the Nazis, against what he called the inhuman fanaticism of the National Socialists. The speech was courageous. It was also dangerous. The audience was hostile, filled with Nazi sympathizers who heckled and interrupted. The newspapers attacked him. The Nazis marked him as an enemy. 3 years later, in 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. The democratic experiment was over. The 1,000-year Reich had begun. Thomas Mann was not in Germany when it happened. He and Katja were on vacation in Switzerland, enjoying the Alps that had inspired the Magic Mountain. They had planned to stay a few weeks and then return home. They received word from their children. Do not come back. Your writings have been blacklisted. Your home has been searched. You are not safe. Their eldest children, Erika and Klaus, who had already fled to France, confirmed the warning. The Nazis were arresting their enemies. Mann's name was on the list. They never returned to Germany, not for decades. Not until after the war, after Hitler was dead, after the Reich lay in ruins. The house in Munich, with its library and manuscripts, its memories and possessions, was lost to them. At first, Mann tried to remain apolitical. He published cautiously. He did not denounce the regime openly. He feared for his property, for his books, for the German audience he had cultivated his entire life. Perhaps he thought he could wait out the madness. Perhaps Germany would come to its senses. But silence was impossible. In 1936, he published an open letter to the University of Bonn, which had stripped him of his honorary doctorate. The letter was a declaration of opposition. He would no longer be silent. The Nazi regime responded by revoking his German citizenship. Thomas Mann, author of Buddenbrooks and the Magic Mountain, was now officially stateless. When asked whether he found exile difficult, whether he felt lonely without his homeland, Mann gave an answer that has become famous. "Where I am, there is Germany. I carry my German culture in me." In 1938, Thomas Mann emigrated to the United States. He settled first in Princeton, New Jersey, where the university offered him a position as a visiting lecturer. Later, he moved to Pacific Palisades, California, a community of German exiles near Los Angeles that included other refugees from fascism: Bertolt Brecht, Arnold Schoenberg, Theodor Adorno. These were strange years for the great German writer. He was in exile from the culture that had produced him, living in a country whose language he spoke imperfectly, watching from across an ocean as his homeland committed crimes that defied comprehension. America was good to him. He was honoured, celebrated, welcomed. Universities invited him to lecture. Publishers published his books. The American public, in its generous way, embraced this distinguished refugee. But he never felt at home. The California sunshine, so different from the grey skies of Northern Europe, seemed false to him. The American way of life, so optimistic and practical, was foreign to his temperament. He longed for the culture he had lost, for the German language, for European complexity, for the world he had known. And yet he was not passive. During the war, Mann made a series of radio broadcasts addressed to German listeners. They were called Deutsche Hörer, German listeners, short speeches recorded in California, transmitted to Europe by the BBC, aimed at reaching those Germans who might still be reached. In these broadcasts, Mann pleaded with his countrymen to reject the Nazi regime. He described the crimes being committed in Germany's name. He reminded Germans of their better traditions, of Goethe and Schiller and Beethoven, of the culture that had once been the glory of Europe. "German listeners," he would begin, "a German writer whom you know speaks to you. One whose work and person have been banned in Germany, whose books, though born of a German soul and German education, are forbidden and hunted there, while in all other parts of the world people can read them in their own language." How many Germans heard these broadcasts we cannot know. How many were moved by them we cannot know. But Mann continued throughout the war, month after month, speaking across the ocean to a homeland he could not visit, hoping that his words might make some difference. In 1944, on the 6th of June, D-Day, the Allied invasion of Normandy, Thomas Mann became an American citizen. It was also his birthday. He was 69 years old. He was now officially American, but in a deeper sense he remained what he had always been, a German writer in exile carrying his culture with him wherever he went. The war ended the following year. Germany surrendered in May of 1945. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had lasted 12. the same span of time it had taken Thomas Mann to write The Magic Mountain. There was terrible irony in this. The novel had predicted catastrophe. It had diagnosed the sickness of European civilization, the seduction of death, the enchantments that led to destruction. And then, with uncanny precision, that catastrophe had occurred. Hans Castorp had descended from the mountain into the First World War. Thomas Mann had descended from the fame of the 1920s into the exile of the 1930s and 40s. The mountain could not protect anyone forever. After the war, Thomas Mann faced a question. Should he return to Germany? The country was in ruins. Cities had been bombed to rubble. Millions were dead. Soldiers and civilians, Germans and their victims. The crimes of the Holocaust had been revealed in all their horror. And yet it was still Germany. It was still the land of Goethe and Bach, of the culture Mann had spent his life serving. Many of his fellow exiles planned to return. Bertolt Brecht would go back to East Germany. Others would return to the West. Mann chose a middle path. He visited Germany several times after the war, but he never lived there again. Instead, he settled near Zurich in Switzerland, the same country where the Magic Mountain was set, the same mountains where Katia had taken her cure so many years before. In 1949, he made a particularly significant visit. He travelled to both Germanys, the Federal Republic in the west and the German Democratic Republic in the east, to receive Goethe prizes from both Frankfurt and Weimar. It was the 200th anniversary of Goethe's birth, and Mann was chosen to give the commemorative address. This decision was controversial. The Cold War had begun. Americans viewed the Communist East with deep suspicion. Some accused Mann of being too sympathetic to the Soviet bloc, of lending legitimacy to the communist regime. But Mann refused to choose sides in this new conflict. He had seen what happened when nations divided against each other, when ideologies demanded absolute loyalty. He had watched one catastrophe. He did not wish to participate in another. "I know only one Germany," he said. "Goethe belongs to all of Germany. I cannot recognize a division of German culture." The Goethe address was remarkable, a meditation on the German genius and the German catastrophe, on the culture that had produced both the greatest art and the greatest crimes. Mann spoke of Goethe's complexity, his darkness as well as his light. He spoke of Germany's need to reckon with its past, to understand how the catastrophe had happened. The final years were peaceful, though not without sadness. His son Klaus, who had struggled with depression and addiction, took his own life in 1949. It was a blow from which Mann never fully recovered. He continued to write Dr. Faustus, a novel about a German composer who sells his soul to the devil, Felix Krull, a comic novel left unfinished at his death, essays and letters and speeches. He watched his remaining children grow and scatter. He corresponded with admirers around the world. His health was good for a man of his age. The moist spot that the doctor had found in 1912 had never developed into anything serious. Whatever it was, it had not killed him. On the 12th of August, 1955, Thomas Mann died in Zurich. He was 80 years old. He had lived through 2 world wars, through the rise and fall of empires, through revolutions in art and politics and technology. He had written some of the most important novels of the 20th century. He had won the Nobel Prize. He had become what he set out to become, a writer of permanent significance. And it had all begun, in some sense, with a train ride to Davos, with a 3-week visit that became a 12-year project, with a novel about a young man who could not leave the mountain. What does the Magic Mountain mean? What is it about? These are questions that have occupied scholars for a century. The novel is so rich, so complex, so layered with meaning that no single interpretation can exhaust it. At its simplest level, it is a story about education. Hans Castorp arrives at the Berghof as an ordinary young man. He leaves, if he leaves at all, as someone transformed. He has been exposed to ideas, to experiences, to ways of thinking that the Flatlands would never have offered. This makes the novel a Bildungsroman, a German term for a novel of formation, a story about the development of a young person into maturity. The genre has a long history in German literature, going back to Goethe's Wilhelm Meister and before. But The Magic Mountain is also a satire of the Bildungsroman. Hans's education leads him not to productive citizenship, but to a battlefield. The wisdom he gains does not save him. It may not even survive him. At another level, the novel is an allegory. The sanatorium represents European civilization before the First World War, a community enchanted by death, seduced by dangerous ideas, suspended in a false peace that cannot last. The debates between Settembrini and NAFTA are the debates that were tearing Europe apart. Reason versus tradition, progress versus authority, the Enlightenment versus its enemies. These ideas did not stay on the mountain. They descended into the trenches and the gas attacks and the mass graves. At yet another level, the novel is a meditation on illness and mortality. What does it mean to be sick? What does it mean to live in the shadow of death? These are questions that every human being must confront. Hans Castorp confronts them with unusual intensity. His 7 years at the Berghof are 7 years of thinking about death, observing it, discussing it, preparing for it. The novel asks whether this is wise or foolish, whether we should engage with death or flee from it. The answer Hans glimpses in the snow, that love must not be conquered by death, is one answer, but it is not the only answer, and Hans himself cannot hold on to it. Perhaps this is the deepest meaning of the novel. Wisdom is fragile, insights fade, we glimpse truths and then forget them. The mountain casts its spell, and we forget what we learned in the storm. Thomas Mann knew this. He had seen it in his own life. He had supported a war and then repented. He had opposed democracy and then embraced it. He had believed things that turned out to be wrong. The Magic Mountain does not offer easy answers. It offers instead a journey through time and ideas and experience, a journey that each reader must make for themselves. If you visit Davos today, you will find a different world from the one Thomas Mann described. The sanatoriums are mostly gone. When antibiotics appeared in the late 1940s, they made the mountain cure obsolete. Streptomycin could kill the tuberculosis bacillus in a matter of months. The fresh air cure, which required years of rest, could not compete. Within a decade, the sanatoriums that had dominated Davos for nearly a century began to close. Some were converted into hotels. Others became conference centres or apartment buildings. A few were demolished entirely. The patients went home, those who survived, and the elaborate culture of the cure disappeared. But some traces remain. The Schatzalp, the grand sanatorium that was one of the models for Mann's Berghof, still stands. It is now the Berghotel Schatzalp, a historic hotel built in the Art Nouveau style. Guests can stay in the same rooms where tuberculosis patients once lay. They can look out at the same views that Hans Castorp contemplated. The building has been preserved almost exactly as it was. The cure terraces are still there, though now guests use them for sunbathing rather than treatment. The proportions and the atmosphere remain. The funicular railway that once carried patients up from the town now carries tourists and skiers. If you know what you are looking for, you can feel the history. The ghosts of the consumptives are still there, in some sense, lying on those terraces watching the clouds drift past, waiting for a cure that might or might not come. The walled hotel, formerly the walled sanatorium where Katia Mann stayed, still exists as well. It has been renovated and modernised, but something of its sanatorium past remains. Visitors can walk the corridors where Thomas Mann walked, can stand on the balconies where he stood. There is also the Thomas Mann Trail, a walking path that connects the walled hotel to the Chatzalp above. Visitors can retrace the author's steps, ascending from the town to the mountain, following the route that Hans Castorp might have taken. Along the way, plaques quote passages from the novel. And every January Davos fills with visitors for a very different kind of gathering. The World Economic Forum brings together presidents and billionaires, prime ministers and CEOs. They meet in conference centres that stand where sanatoriums once stood. They discuss the future of the global economy in the same mountain air that was supposed to cure tuberculosis. There is something darkly comic about this. The town that tuberculosis built has become the town where the powerful meet to shape the world. The invalids have been replaced by elites. The cure terraces have been replaced by reception halls. Thomas Mann would have appreciated the irony. His novel was partly about the isolation of a privileged class, about people who withdrew from the world into a comfortable cocoon of illness and philosophy. The World Economic Forum is also, in its way, an isolated gathering of the privileged. People who meet on a mountain to discuss problems that seem distant from ordinary life. Perhaps the magic of the mountain takes different forms in different eras. The Magic Mountain has been read in dozens of languages by millions of readers for over a century. The first English translation appeared in 1927, just 3 years after the German publication. It was made by Helen Tracy Lowe Porter, who would translate most of Mann's major works over the following decades. Mann admired Lowe Porter's dedication. He called her Di Lowe, the lioness. She worked tirelessly to bring his work to English readers, wrestling with his complex sentences and dense philosophical passages. Her translation shaped how an entire generation of English-speaking readers experienced Thomas Mann. But scholars later found problems in her translations. She had simplified passages, smoothed out difficulties, sometimes misunderstood the German. Her Magic Mountain, though readable, was not quite Mann's Magic Mountain. In 1995, a new English translation appeared. John E. Woods produced a version that was acclaimed for its accuracy and energy. It won the Helen and Kurt Wolff Translators Prize. It made the novel more accessible to English readers than ever before, while remaining faithful to Mann's intricate style. New translations continue to appear. Each generation of translators brings new perspectives, new sensibilities. The novel remains challenging, over 1,000 pages of German philosophical prose, but it continues to find translators willing to take on the task. Why does it endure? Perhaps because its themes are eternal. Time and death, love and illness, the tension between engagement and withdrawal. These are questions that every generation must face. Perhaps also because the novel is so generous. It offers so many ideas, so many perspectives, so many ways of thinking that readers can find their own meanings within it. The reader who comes to the novel at 20 finds one book. The reader who returns at 40 finds another. The reader who reads it in old age finds something different still. Settembrini's humanism speaks to some readers. Nafta's dark skepticism speaks to others. The love story between Hans and Claudia touches hearts across cultures and eras. In 2024, the novel celebrated its centennial. Events were held in Davos and around the world. Scholars published new studies. Readers returned to the text, finding it as relevant as ever. A century is a long time for a novel to remain in print, to remain in readers' minds. Many books that were celebrated in 1924 have been forgotten. The Magic Mountain has not. It continues to cast its spell. There is a darker dimension to the novel's legacy. Thomas Mann wrote The Magic Mountain as a diagnosis. He was trying to understand what had gone wrong with European civilization, what enchantments had led to the catastrophe of the First World War. The diagnosis was accurate. The novel identified the dangerous ideas, the seduction of death, the intellectual conflicts that were tearing Europe apart. It ended with its protagonist marching into battle into the World Festival of Death. But the diagnosis did not prevent the disease from recurring. Less than 20 years after the novel's publication, Europe was at war again. The second catastrophe was even worse than the first. More deaths, more destruction, more horror. The ideas that NAFTA represents, authoritarianism, irrationalism, contempt for liberal values, did not die in the trenches of the First World War. They came back stronger. They conquered Germany. They nearly conquered the world. Thomas Mann spent the second half of his life fighting these ideas. His radio broadcasts, his essays, his public appearances, all were aimed at combating the darkness he had diagnosed so precisely in his novel. Did it matter? Did his words make any difference? This is not a question we can answer with certainty, but the fact that he spoke, that he refused to remain silent, that he used his fame and his talent in the service of humanity, this matters. It is an example of what a writer can do in a time of crisis. And the novel itself remains a warning. It shows how intelligent people can be seduced by dangerous ideas. It shows how the enchantments of death can capture minds that should know better. It shows what happens when civilizations forget to choose life. Every generation must learn these lessons for itself. The Magic Mountain is one of the texts from which they can learn. Today, a century after the novel's publication, its warnings feel newly urgent. The intellectual conflicts it diagnoses have not gone away. The tension between reason and authority, between openness and closure, between life and death. These tensions persist. The Magic Mountain is always there. The enchantment is always waiting, and the choice between life and death must be made anew by each generation. We began with a misdiagnosis. Let us end with one as well. Katia Mann was treated for tuberculosis. She spent months at the Sanatorium. She followed the prescribed regimen: rest, rich food, mountain air. She was treated as though she had the disease. But when her X-rays were later examined, doctors found no evidence of tuberculosis. Whatever she had suffered from, it was not the White Plague. She lived to be 97 years old, dying in 1980, far outliving her husband, far outliving the disease she never had. This means that The Magic Mountain, the greatest tuberculosis novel ever written, was inspired by an illness that was not tuberculosis. There is something fitting about this. The novel is, in part, about the uncertain boundary between sickness and health. Hans Castorp may or may not be ill. His symptoms are real, but their meaning is unclear. The doctors find what they expect to find. Perhaps all illness is partly constructed. Perhaps the categories we use to understand our bodies are always partly imaginary. We name our sufferings and thereby give them power over us. The naming makes them real. Or perhaps the misdiagnosis points to a different truth. The power of the sanatorium was never really about medicine. It was about something else, about community, about ritual, about a way of life that made meaning out of suffering. Whether or not the mountain air could cure tuberculosis, It provided something that the flatlands could not: a place to rest, a place to think, a place to confront mortality without the distractions of ordinary life, a place where time moved differently and the questions that mattered could finally be asked. Thomas Mann understood this. His novel captures not the medical reality of the sanatorium, but its psychological and spiritual reality. The enchantment was real, even if the cure was not. And so, a misdiagnosis gave birth to a masterpiece. An illness that wasn't became a novel that will never fade. A 3-week visit became 12 years of writing. A doctor's invitation that was refused became a work of art that has shaped how we think about time and death and love. This is the alchemy of art. It transforms everything it touches, even error, even confusion, even the mistakes of doctors reading X-rays in the alpine light. Let us pause now and consider what we have witnessed tonight. We have followed Thomas Mann from the merchant houses of Lübeck to the Cure terraces of Davos. We have watched him board a train in 1912, intending a 3-week visit, carrying in his mind the first glimmers of a novel. We have seen him return to Munich, reject the doctor's invitation to stay, begin writing a short satirical piece. We have seen that piece grow and transform over 12 years, interrupted by a world war, shaped by the catastrophe of European civilization. We have met Hans Castorp, that ordinary young man who became, through 7 years on the mountain, something extraordinary. We have watched him fall under the spell of the Berghof, under the spell of Claudia Chauchat, under the spell of ideas that would shape his thinking forever. We have listened to the great debates between Settembrini and Naphta, debates that were also the debates of Europe, debates that would be settled not by words but by guns. We have stood with hands in the snow, glimpsing a truth about love and death that he could not hold on to. We have watched him descend the mountain finally into a war that would destroy the world he knew. And we have followed Thomas Mann through his own descent, into exile, into America, into the long years of fighting fascism from across an ocean. We have seen him return to Europe, to Switzerland, to the mountains where it all began. This is not a simple story. It is a story about how art is made, about how life becomes literature, about how a 3-week visit can reshape the course of literary history. It is also a story about ideas and their consequences, about the seductions of death and the claims of life, about what happens when civilizations forget to choose. What does all of this mean for us now, more than a century after Mann boarded that train to Davos? The Magic Mountain is often called a novel about its time, a portrait of pre-war Europe, a diagnosis of civilizational sickness, and it is all of these things. But it is also a novel about our time. The questions it raises have not been answered, the tensions it diagnoses have not been resolved. We still face the conflict between reason and unreason, between liberal values and authoritarian temptation. We still face the seduction of withdrawal, the desire to escape from the demands of the world into some protected space where normal rules do not apply. We still face the question that Hans Castorp faced, whether to engage with the world or withdraw from it, whether to descend to the flatlands and take up the work of living, or to remain on our own mountains, enchanted by our own illusions. The pandemic years made this question newly urgent. We too experienced a suspension of normal time. We too were forced to confront mortality in ways we usually avoid. We too discovered the strange seductions of withdrawal, the way that isolation can become a kind of refuge. There are no easy answers. There never were. This is what the novel teaches us, that wisdom is not a destination but a journey, that truth is not possessed but pursued. Hans glimpsed something in the snow. He forgot it. Perhaps the lesson is not that we should try to remember what he glimpsed, but that we should try to glimpse something ourselves. The novel invites us into its world. It invites us to think, to question, to engage with ideas that may be uncomfortable. It does not tell us what to believe. It shows us what belief costs. This is the gift of great literature. It does not simplify. It complicates. It does not answer. It asks. What do we carry forward from this story? Perhaps the knowledge that great art can come from unlikely sources, a misdiagnosis, a 3-week visit, a doctor's invitation that was refused. Perhaps the understanding that time works differently than we expect. 12 years to write a novel, 7 years on a mountain, a century of readers finding new meanings in the same text. Perhaps the warning that enchantment is dangerous. The mountain casts its spell. The ideas that seem harmless in isolation can, when taken to extremes, tear civilizations apart. And perhaps the hope that Hans Castorp glimpsed in the snow, that for the sake of goodness and love, we might refuse to let death have sovereignty over our thoughts. This is not easy. Hans himself could not hold on to it. Thomas Mann, for all his insight, could not prevent the catastrophes of the 20th century. But the attempt matters. The effort to understand, to engage, to choose life over death. This is what literature calls us to. The Magic Mountain does not offer solutions. It offers company. It offers the companionship of a great mind struggling with the questions that haunt all of us. And that companionship, across a century, across languages and cultures and catastrophes, that is something worth having. We read and we are less alone. We read and we are connected to others who have read before us, and who will read after. We read and we join a conversation that has been going on for a century and will continue for centuries more. This is the magic of the mountain. Not the cure, not the fresh air, but the conversation, the ideas, the attempt to understand what we are and what we might become. Let us return, one final time, to that train climbing through the Alps. It is May of 1912. A man of 36 looks out the window at the mountains. He is travelling to visit his wife. He plans to stay for 3 weeks. He does not know what awaits him. He does not know that he will find the setting for his greatest novel. He does not know that the world is about to tear itself apart. He knows only that the air is thin and clear, that the peaks are beautiful, that somewhere ahead his wife lies on a balcony, breathing, waiting. This is how great art begins. Not with grand intentions, but with small circumstances. A train ride, a visit, a doctor who finds a spot on a lung. Thomas Mann took what life gave him and transformed it. He spent 12 years shaping his experiences into a novel that would outlast empires. And now we too have made the journey. We have climbed the mountain and descended again. We have encountered the ideas and the characters, the love and the death, the enchantment and the breaking of the spell. The Wald Sanatorium still stands in Davos. It is called the Wald Hotel now. Guests can stay where Katja stayed, look out at the same mountains, breathe the same air. The Schatzalp still stands too, its Art Nouveau elegance preserved, its Cure terraces open to the sun. And the novel stands, perhaps the most lasting monument of all, more permanent than buildings which can crumble, more lasting than empires which can fall. 1,000 pages, 100 characters, 12 years of writing, a century of reading. And at its heart a simple question: how should we live knowing that we must die? The novel does not answer this question, but it helps us ask it. It helps us ask it with depth, with seriousness, with the kind of attention that the question deserves. For the sake of goodness and love, man shall let death have no sovereignty over his thoughts. Hans forgot this. We need not. The fire has burned low now. The mountain air drifts through an open window, thin and cold and clear. Somewhere, in a sanatorium that no longer exists, a young man lies on a cure terrace watching the snow fall on the peaks above. He's thinking about time and death and love. He's wondering whether he will ever descend to the flatlands below. Somewhere else, an old man sits at his desk writing the final pages of a novel that has consumed 12 years of his life. He's wondering whether anyone will read it. He's wondering whether it matters. And somewhere else still, in a library, in a bedroom, in a quiet corner of a busy life, a reader turns the final page of a 1,000-page book and sits in silence, letting the story settle, letting the meaning emerge. This is the chain that connects us, the writer to the reader, the past to the present, the mountain to the flatlands below. Thomas Mann died in 1955. Hans Castorp disappeared into the mud and smoke of Flanders more than a century ago. The sanatoriums are gone, the war is over, the world has moved on. But the novel remains, and as long as it remains, something of that world survives, something of those questions persists, something of that struggle continues. Next time on the Sanatorium we'll explore another corner of this history, but that journey is for another night. For now, rest well. Let the memory of the mountain air carry you into sleep. Let the questions Hans Castorp asked, questions about time and death and love, fade into the background of your dreams. You do not need to answer them tonight. You need only rest. If you found some measure of peace in tonight's journey, perhaps leave a like or share it with someone who might need it, someone who has their own mountains to climb, their own enchantments to escape. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking this journey through a novel and a life, through the sanatoriums and the snow, through a century of reading and rereading. The mountain will still be there tomorrow. The novel will still be waiting. The questions will still be asking themselves, as they have for 100 years. But for now, let them go. Let the spell of the mountain release you gently into sleep. For the sake of goodness and love, good night.